It happened so quietly you almost missed it. One morning, maybe last winter, maybe last spring, a small bird landed closer to you than it ever had before. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that you both knew something had shifted. You held still. It held still. And for just a moment, two entirely separate worlds existed in the same silence. You probably called it tame, or curious, or maybe you smiled and walked away and never thought about it again. But something was happening inside that bird's brain at that exact moment that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. Something ancient, something deeply wired, something that, if you knew the truth of it, would change the way you stand in your own backyard forever. Because what a bird is doing the first time it trusts you, it is not simply relaxing. It is making one of the most irreversible decisions its brain is capable of. To understand what trust means to a bird, you first have to understand what fear has built inside them. Every single bird alive today is descended from a bloodline that has survived predators for over 150 million years. That is not a metaphor. That is evolutionary engineering. The bird ear feeder carries in its nervous system a threat detection system so finely tuned it can process danger and react before a conscious thought forms. Researchers at the University of Exeter studied what they call the flight initiation distance, the point at which an animal chooses to flee rather than hold ground. For most wild birds, this distance is hardwired to err massively on the side of escape. The cost of fleeing unnecessarily is just a few seconds of lost foraging. The cost of staying too long is death. And evolution does not forgive the birds that guessed wrong. So when a bird inches closer to you, when it narrows that distance, it is not being careless. Something in its brain has begun a negotiation that runs far deeper than instinct. Inside the bird's brain sits a structure called the amygdala-like region, a cluster of neurons that in mammals we associate with fear, memory, and emotional learning. In birds, this region is called the archopallium, and it is extraordinarily active. It is constantly receiving data, every flicker of movement in its peripheral vision, every unfamiliar sound, every new shape that appears in the environment. Your backyard is not peaceful to a bird. It is a constant stream of threat assessments running in parallel. And you, standing there with your coffee or your seed bag or simply your quiet presence, you were once part of that threat stream. You were filed away as a large, unpredictable, mammalian shape. Something to be watched. Something to be escaped from. What changed? And more strangely, how did the bird know that you specifically were the one worth risking trust on? Here is something the bird at your feeder has been doing that most people never realize. It has been watching you. Not occasionally, consistently. It noticed the time you usually appear in the morning. It registered the particular way you move, whether you are slow and deliberate or rushed and erratic. It cross-referenced your presence against what happened afterward. Did food appear? Did danger follow? Was the environment predictable? What researchers at Cambridge discovered when they spent years studying corvids, jays, crows, ravens, is that these birds maintain what can only be described as social files on specific humans. They remember individual faces. They remember specific interactions. They even pass that information to other birds. A crow in Seattle was once treated poorly by a researcher wearing a particular mask. Weeks later, crows that had never encountered that researcher, but had been around those that had, mobbed the same mask on sight. Your backyard birds are doing a quieter version of this constantly. They are building a model of you, not consciously, the way you might, but neurologically, in the pattern of their predictions, in the calibration of their flight distance, in the way their heart rate settles or spikes when you appear. You have been leaving a trace in their neural wiring without ever knowing it. And this is the part that changes everything. Because the first time a bird truly trusts you, it is not just opening up. It is updating a prediction it has spent weeks calculating. Imagine you could see inside that bird's brain in the exact second it decides to land closer. There is a conversation happening between the archopallium and a region called the nidopallium caudolateral, the bird's equivalent of the prefrontal cortex. This is where executive decisions live, where predictions get updated. where the brain says, the old rule no longer applies. Dopamine. Yes, the same molecule behind human reward and motivation floods that system when a prediction is confirmed in a positive direction. When the bird held still and you did not lunge, when it came closer and the world did not collapse, each of those moments released a small neurochemical reward. Not metaphorically, literally. The bird's brain was being chemically shaped by your consistency. Dr. Alex Taylor at the University of Auckland, whose work on bird cognition has upended what we thought possible in non-mammalian brains, describes this process as prediction error learning. The brain constantly generates a model of what it expects. When reality is safer than expected, the model updates. When this happens repeatedly, the gap between expected danger and actual experience narrows. And then, one morning, something extraordinary occurs. The prediction shifts from that human is a threat to that human is a known safe variable. Safe variable. That is what science calls it. But what it feels like for the bird is something we might recognize as relief. We use the word trust loosely. For humans, trust is something we choose, sometimes easily, sometimes painfully. But for a wild bird, trust is a physiological cost. Because allowing a large mammal into your safe zone means permanently altering your escape parameters. It means that if you were wrong, if this particular human turns out to be dangerous, you have given up the margin of safety that kept your ancestors alive. This is why certain species trust faster than others. Black-capped chickadees, house sparrows, robins, birds that evolved alongside human settlements, carry a kind of modified threat calibration that allows for faster social learning around humans. But even within a species, individual birds vary. Some never fully trust. Some have had early negative experiences that permanently recalibrate their flee distance. The bird that comes closest to you in your yard is not just being friendly. It has, by any neurological definition, done something brave. There is a study out of Sweden that measured cortisol, the stress hormone, in urban versus rural birds of the same species. Urban birds showed measurably lower baseline cortisol in human presence. But the rural birds brought into urban environments showed something remarkable. Within a few weeks, their cortisol response began to drop, but only around specific humans they had encountered repeatedly, not humans in general. Specific individuals. Your presence has a neurochemical signature in the bird's body. You are not interchangeable. Think about that. Somewhere in your neighborhood, there may be a bird whose baseline physiology is measurably calmer because of you. We have spent centuries assuming that the minds of small birds are simple, reactive, instinct-driven, and in doing so we have completely missed what was happening in plain sight. A bird navigating trust is performing something neuroscientists call theory of other minds. The capacity to model another being's intentions, to predict their behavior, to weigh outcomes based on past interactions with that individual. Until recently, we believed this was exclusively a mammalian achievement. We were wrong. Studies with scrub jays revealed that they hide food caches differently depending on whether they believe they have been observed, and by whom. They track the intentions of specific observers. They behave differently with individuals they perceive as trustworthy versus those they do not. They are not just reacting to the world, they are modeling it. And they are modeling you inside it. The bird that watches you from the branch is not simply waiting for seed. It is running a continuous simulation. Where will this person move next? What is their emotional state? What has happened the last 17 times they appeared in this space? The density of information that a bird processes about a specific, recurring human is something we would more naturally associate with social primates. And yet it is happening every morning, outside your window, in a creature with a brain the size of a walnut. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody tells you. Because there is something the bird is doing with that trust that reveals more about the nature of consciousness than most of us are prepared to accept. When you stand very still and a bird lands near you, your nervous system responds. Your breathing slows. Your visual focus sharpens. A quiet forms inside you. An involuntary pause that is distinct from any other kind of quiet. Researchers who study human-animal contact have a name for this state. They call it attentive stillness, and it is characterized by measurable drops in cortisol, in heart rate, in the activation of the default mode network, the part of your brain responsible for self-referential thought, worry, planning. In other words, the bird makes you stop living in your head. There is an old Japanese concept called calm or be, the light that filters through leaves. There is no English word for it. In the same way, there may be no word for what happens when a wild bird chooses your presence. It is not simply observation. It is a form of contact that crosses the boundary between two very different kinds of consciousness. A moment where the world's enormous indifference briefly contracts into something personal. The bird did not have to choose your yard. It did not have to choose your particular corner of the fence. It did not have to hold still when you appeared. In a world of infinite escape routes, it chose to stay. And something in your ancient mammalian brain, the part that evolved in deep contact with the natural world, before cities, before screens, before the great human withdrawal from wilderness, recognized that and responded. Two nervous systems, two evolutionary histories, two completely different architectures of consciousness. And yet, something passed between them, something real enough to measure in cortisol, in dopamine, in the quiet of a held breath. Here is perhaps the most unsettling and beautiful thing the research reveals. The bird recognized you as an individual before you recognized yourself as meaningful to it. You were living your ordinary morning, filling a feeder, drinking coffee, absently moving through your yard, while a small creature with a brain wired for survival was performing detailed, dedicated social cognition about your specific patterns, movements, and reliability. The bird was paying attention to you in ways you were not paying attention to yourself. It noticed that you move differently on weekends. It noticed that when you wear the red jacket, you come closer before leaving. It noticed that your voice, when you speak softly, does not correlate with danger. It built a model of you that included data points you never consciously offered. And then, when enough of those data points aligned with safety, it made the decision that you were worth approaching. There is something philosophically extraordinary about being truly seen by a creature that has no cultural reason to trust you. A dog trusts because trust has been bred into it across 10,000 years of domestication. A cat trusts because it calculates comfort. But a wild bird trusts because you, specifically, individually, in the specific way you have moved through your yard on specific mornings, have passed a test more ancient and more honest than any human relationship assessment. You were evaluated without performance, watched without knowing you were being watched, and found safe. You passed a test you never knew you were taking. And the grade was given by something that cannot be deceived by what you say, only by what you consistently do. We live, most of us, in a profound isolation from the rest of the living world. We have built our lives inside materials and systems that separate us from the rhythms and intelligences that surrounded our species for millions of years. And somewhere in that separation, we began to forget that the world is watching us back. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Specifically, a crow remembers your face longer than many acquaintances will. A chickadee carries a record of your presence in its behavioral wiring. A bird that lands near you has made a biological commitment based on evidence you unknowingly provided. This is what is really happening in your yard on a quiet morning. Not a bird appearing, not nature being pretty. A form of cognition. Ancient, precise, emotionally real in some functional sense, extending across the boundary between species. An intelligence you never studied for looking back. At an intelligence that rarely looks up. And, for a moment, in the space between a feeder and a branch, two completely separate evolutionary stories exist in the same breath of awareness. The bird that trusted you changed. Its neural predictions were permanently updated. The threshold in its archopallium shifted. The flight distance it will hold with you is now different, measurably, biologically different than the one it holds with strangers. You are, in the only way that matters to a wild creature, known. Not loved in the way we use that word, but known in the way the nervous system uses it. Recognized, mapped, held in the wiring of a small life that is trying every day to survive a world that mostly does not notice it at all. And maybe, in some quiet, unscientific way. That is what trust has always been. Not the absence of risk, but the decision that this particular presence is worth it. Remember the moment at the beginning, that bird landing closer than ever before, both of you holding still. You thought it was a small thing, a lucky morning, a coincidence of timing. But now you know it was the end of a long calculation. It was the moment a nervous system that had been watching you, carefully, patiently, over weeks of ordinary mornings, arrived at its conclusion. And its conclusion was you. The yard looks the same as always. The feeder is the same, the branch is the same, but something in it is different now because you know what the silence is carrying. You know what the stillness means. You know that somewhere in the neural architecture of the small creature perched at the edge of your world, there is a version of you, a pattern, a prediction, a physiological response that did not exist before you started showing up. We spend so much of our lives wondering if we matter, wondering if we leave any real trace. And here, in the most ordinary place imaginable, a back garden, a morning, a feeder full of sunflower seeds, a wild thing with ancient eyes, and a brain refined by 150 million years of survival has quietly answered that question, not with words, with approach, with narrow distance, with held ground when every instinct said flee. The next time a bird comes close to you, let yourself feel the full weight of what that means, because it is not a small thing. It is not a coincidence. It is one of the oldest forms of recognition still available to us in the modern world, and it is happening right outside your window, every morning, whether or not you stop to notice. Has there ever been a moment, one specific morning, one particular bird, that made you feel genuinely seen by something wild? Tell me what happened. I want to know.